Push Nation.
Today we're going to be talking about the post-Cold War era in the 1970s.
There are three main things we need to focus on.
Détente, ping pong diplomacy, and salt.
This is not what
Fireside chat.
Fireside chat.
Fireside chat.
Fireside chat.
Fireside chat.
Fireside chat.
No.
Hey, APUSHNation. So our Fireside chat mostly concerns the period towards the end of the Cold War in which the US and the USSR began to seek better relations. But before we do that, let's get some context. During World War I, Russia had the Bolshevik Revolution, which basically overthrew the Tsar autocracy and led to the establishment of a provisional government, and then the first Marxist state led by Lenin. In 1922, the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was established. But what does that have to do with the United States? Well, the United States became extremely fearful of communism and communist ideals that arose due to the Bolshevik Revolution, which were often the polar opposite of American democratic beliefs. For example, communism entails economic equality, which contradicts the United States' capitalism. Furthermore, Americans were deterred by the mass killings of Lenin, Stalin, and China's Mao. Also, there was basically no free speech or free press in the Soviet Union. Tensions between the US and the USSR really began when World War II began winding down. The attack on Pearl Harbor made America feel weak and vulnerable. And in order to end the war and boast their power, the United States used atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. The use of such a barbaric weapon that had such capabilities frightened the USSR. The Soviet Union became nervous and was afraid of what else the United States had behind its back. And the US was uncomfortable with Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe. The actual Cold War was characterized by a clash of ideologies and things like the Cuban Missile Crisis and the space race, which led to the United States landing on the moon. These tensions lasted for most of the 50s and 60s. So basically what it was a clash of capitalism versus communism, in which each country was threatened by the other.
Hey, Push Nation. So, the tensions Rhea just mentioned lasted for most of the 50s and 60s. But as we mentioned before, our Fireside chat really concerns a specific period in the Cold War in which the United States and the Soviet Union began working towards more peaceful relations. But before we can really discuss what this new attitude was or how it was implemented into international policy, it's really important to understand the specific causes that brought about this change. Now, there are four main reasons for this shift. Firstly, the Vietnam War. The US was struggling to end the Vietnam War, and thousands of American lives had been lost. As a result, the US was a lot less confident about a Cold War victory and didn't want to enter into another overseas war. Secondly, money problems. Both sides were facing severe financial issues at the time. The US and the USSR both struggled to pay for domestic policies and could no longer afford the expensive manufacturing of nuclear weapons. Thirdly, the fear of war. Both the USSR and the US feared what could happen in a nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis had shown how close such a war really was and caused fear in both countries. Additionally, the CND, or the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, was successful in limiting the nuclear weapons in Western Europe. Countries such as France and Britain began putting pressure on the United States to also start limiting their nuclear weapons. And lastly, China. After developing nuclear weapons in 1954, China played a particularly influential role in the shift towards this new attitude. Although it was officially a communist nation, China was not a firm supporter of the Soviet Union. The US and China began developing better relations when President Nixon visited China in 1972. The Soviet Union, worried that a US-China alliance could severely weaken them, also began seeking better relations with the US. So now we've discussed the four main reasons why the United States and the Soviet Union began seeking better relations in the 1970s.
Hey, APUSHNation. Anna just mentioned how China played an influential role in easing tensions between the US and the USSR. So now we're going to talk about the specific role China played through a concept known as ping pong diplomacy. Our relations with China were just as strained as they were with Russia before the Cold War. The United States had issue with Mao Zedong's communist regime, which was established in 1949. After Mao's victory, the United States was conflicted about whether or not to recognize formally the People's Republic of China. The Truman administration intended to do so eventually, but internal concerns about the outbreak of the Korean War delayed this. Chiang Kai-shek had much support from the American people, and to say the American people were wary of communism was certainly an understatement. Eventually, Nixon visited China and opened our relations with them. This was the origin of some of the current policies with China, including the One China policy, which recognizes China's authority over Taiwan. Initially, post-Cold War US-China relations were significantly shaped by tensions between the USSR and the PRC. For some background, Joseph Stalin had not backed Mao Zedong against the nationalists during World War II, and he insisted that China pay cash for weapons during the Korean War, an unpopular policy. Over time, the USSR grew skeptical of China and their alliance. For example, they withdrew their support of China's nuclear weapons program. President Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, took notice of the USSR and PRC's deteriorating relationships, and they opened secret channels of communication to let China know that we were interested in ending our isolation of the PRC. So basically, before we reached friendly relations with Russia, we improved our relations with China due to their conflict with Russia. An example of the increasingly friendly relations with China came with ping-pong diplomacy. The reason it was called ping-pong diplomacy is because the tensions were eased over a game of ping-pong. So let's get into how it started. The U.S. table tennis team was invited to participate in the 31st World Table Tennis Champions on April 6, 1971, in Japan. Was the unexpected but dramatic meeting between the American player Glenn Cohen and the Chinese player Zhuang Zedong. The events leading up to the encounter began when Glenn Cohen missed his team bus one afternoon during the 31st World Table Tennis Championship. As Cohen looked for his team bus that had left, a Chinese player waved to him to get on his team bus to travel to the championships.
Glenn Cohen says, "Oh no, I missed my bus." China player says, "Why don't you come on my bus?" Glenn Cohen says, "Sure, why not?" China player says, "Let's play in China sometime." Glenn Cohen says, "Sure, why not?" A fun fact about this incident is that Zhuang Zedong gave Cohen a silkscreen picture of China's Huangshan Mountains, while Cohen gave Zhuang a t-shirt that said the Beatles lyric, "Let It Be." Furthermore, this triggered an annual tournament between American and Chinese players for many years to come in the game of ping pong. So, as you can see, during this time, there were several ways that the US and China's relations shifted. For example, Nixon's visit in 1972 and ping pong diplomacy were two notable instances when these two nations worked together for better relations. But how did this new US-China alliance affect US-Soviet relations? Well, the USSR became worried that this new alliance could seriously damage them, so they too started working towards a better relation with the US in a mentality known as Détente.
Hey Bush Nation, let's talk about détente. To get started, let's define détente. Détente refers to the cooling of tensions between the US and Russia after the Cold War. The real beginning of détente came in 1972 when Nixon met with the Secretary General of the Soviet Communist Party for the SALT talks, which we'll talk about later. So, how did détente come about? Well, Nixon's philosophy was peace with honor. He actively sought to end the Cold War with diplomacy. After the Vietnam War, the US is no longer interested in actively fighting the USSR over their communist ideals. And his agenda also included opening up relations with China, for example, ping-pong diplomacy. Both countries stood to gain if trade could be increased and the danger of nuclear war reduced. In addition, Nixon, a candidate for re-election, was under fire at home from those demanding social change, racial equality, and an end to the Vietnam War. The trip to Russia, like his historic trip to China a few months earlier, permitted him to keep public attention focused on his foreign policy achievements rather than his domestic problems. The trip also led to greater Soviet willingness to cooperate. In April of 1971, we lifted our trade embargo with China, which had been in place since the start of the Korean War. In that same month, the ping-pong incident occurred. The prospect of improved relations with the US and China concerned Russia, leading to their willingness to participate in agreements such as SALT and taking steps to reduce tensions between the US and the USSR. Economic motives played a large role in cooling these tensions. Trade and cooperation between the two countries would be mutually beneficial. For example, the Soviets began buying American grain due to a suggestion from Nixon. In 1973, public sentiment grew overwhelmingly in opposition to détente due to human rights abuses in Russia. For example, Senator Henry M. Jackson of Washington State vocally opposed Russia's treatment of Jewish people. After Nixon resigned, Gerald Ford made it clear to the Soviets that his new administration was still committed to détente. Détente resolved the tensions through SALT. the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. SALT was a series of conferences and treaties between the USA and USSR where we basically agreed on some ground rules on armaments and weapons. Nixon and Brezhnev signed the ABM Treaty and SALT I agreements in 1972 Moscow. These limited the strategic missile defenses for both the US and USSR. Negotiations for a second round of SALT began in late 1972. SALT II further limited the total of both nations' nuclear forces. However, a broad coalition of Republicans and conservative Democrats grew increasingly skeptical of the Soviet Union. With the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, the Congress believed that the USSR would not honestly adhere to the agreement, thus did not ratify SALT II into force.
Go.
Let's wrap things up.
So what did we learn today?
As you can see, relationships with Russia have not always been as warm and toasty as they are today.
But here's what you should remember about the Cold War.
It wasn't actually a war. It was like a thing people do before they fight when they stare at each other and act super tough to intimidate the other person.
It spilled over to proxy wars and conflict in other areas of the world.
It also fueled economic and technological growth through our competition with Russia, like the space race, which we won allegedly by putting a man on the moon.
And it lasted from approximately 1945 to 1980.
In the 1970s, these tensions began to cool.
The US began to have a détente mindset, which means the soothing of relations.
A great example of this is ping-pong diplomacy.
Furthermore, the US and Russia made steps to make things less salty with more salt.
From all this, we can now gain a more holistic understanding of our current relations with Russia, China, and the like. The Cold War, especially in the 1970s, is a prime example of how the past shapes the future.